I just want to take a moment to say, as far as housekeeping goes, that if you have any questions, please send me an email or please send me a message on Canvas. I can get to your emails much more quickly than I can to messages on Canvas, but please keep me in the loop. Let me know what's going on so that I can assist you. We know that from the time that you entered college, you've been asked to do a lot of research, to understand the research, to investigate the research, and to make sense of it. And all of that makes good sense, except we need to also be able to understand how to evaluate it. In education, each individual area has its own parameters for what constitutes good research. So in special education, there are standards that are set by the Council for Exceptional Children, which say a qualitative study should have these parameters, a quantitative study should have these things, single subject, etc. So each area of education has its own parameters about what constitutes good research. Because we have so many different disciplines in each of our courses, we don't get into those specifics. But it's important to understand that educational research is held to a certain bar depending on which specialization field it focuses on. As you get started reading research, what you're going to find is each article has some sort of problem that it's trying to answer. And typically this is known as a hypothesis. So researchers are looking to figure out what's happening and why is that happening. This can be done in a lot of different ways through different methodologies, but this is the general purpose of research. This is really important because as you start looking for research articles for the topics that you're interested in, it's important to be able to differentiate between a research article and something like a practitioner article or an editorial piece. So we'll talk throughout this particular PowerPoint about what constitutes research so that when you start digging in, you're able to identify very quickly what research is and what research isn't. Once a researcher has identified the hypothesis and kind of the purpose of the individual article, then they want to start looking at a sample. To answer research questions, we're going to pull first from a population of students. So a population of students may be all third graders. It might be all elementary school students. It could be all students with learning disabilities, all students whose English is a second language, all students who are in a middle school setting and are considered at risk for reading fluency. Those are all considered populations. Of course, a researcher wants to look at all these populations at once, but it's impossible. We can't look at all the third graders everywhere. So what we have to do is take a representative sample. So when you're reading research, you'll see that the researchers are going to be talking about the sample, which is the population, a piece of the population. What can be really challenging about educational research is that there are some populations within education that are very small or they're very heterogeneous in terms of characteristics. So let me give you an example. The population of students who have an intellectual disability is only 1 to 2% of the entire school population. That is an extremely small number of the whole population of students. To take a sample of that huge population can be very difficult because oftentimes you don't find students with intellectual disabilities grouped together in one school or in one county. So if we're looking at 1% of the entire population of students, and we want to just look at that 1% as our whole population, digging down and finding an available sample can be very tough. The other problem is that oftentimes our samples are very heterogeneous. So in other words, I may have a school district in Omaha and a school district in the Bronx, but those two groups of third graders are vastly different. We're talking about different populations, we're talking about different socioeconomic status, we're talking about different ethnicity, different backgrounds. So things are so different between those two groups that when we take a sample, we need to be cognizant of the fact that there are differences. And that's what's really hard in education, because you have to get very specific with the types of students that you want to look at, and oftentimes finding a sample can be challenging, if not extremely difficult, especially when we're trying to get a large number of students to represent that population. After the researcher has identified the population that they want to use and picked their sample, the next thing that takes place is the actual research. This can happen with individual case studies, surveys, questionnaires, or intervention research. There's no one prescriptive way to do research with each population or with each subject level, but you will tend to see more types of research with certain types of populations and samples. For example, I just gave you that example of working with students who are intellectually disabled. Well, if that's your sample, chances are you're only going to have maybe a handful of kids within a certain radius that you're going to be able to research. So you're not going to have a big enough number to do something like a large quantitative study. You're going to need to do an individual case study or some single subject design where you're looking at students almost on an individual basis, because you just don't have a large enough sample. On the other hand, if you're looking at all third graders, all fourth graders, that's when you can get into those big quantitative studies where you're looking at large data sets. Okay, so you will see a correlation in education with types of disabilities, types of students, even certain types of curriculum will be more heavy in case studies or will be more heavy in intervention research or surveys. A lot of intervention research out there on reading curriculums, a lot of intervention research out there on math. Those types of things, actually, you will see researchers trying an intervention and then recording the results. Once the study's been completed, the researcher puts the results together. So they take all their findings and tell you what they found. Normally, when you're reading a research article, it's because they found something. There are lots and lots of research studies that are done where they find nothing. But what do you think happens to those research studies in terms of the ability to be published? They don't get published unless they're telling you something really, really important anyway. So oftentimes what you do find are things that do work, as opposed to research studies that have just kind of not found anything, if that makes sense. All the terminology that I'm telling you about and all these components of research that I'm telling you about, we'll go into more deeply as we start looking at individual methodologies, but this is an overview about what you're going to see in a research article. You'll also see some information on reliability and validity. So in all research, you're going to see whether the confidence level of whether or not the study is valid. In other words, is that study measuring what it's supposed to measure? Is the intervention, is the tool that's being used for the assessment, is it really measuring what it's supposed to measure? That makes it valid. What makes something reliable is whether or not it could be replicated. So if I were to use a tool in my classroom to teach my students math, and then I give that same tool to one of you and say, here, you go use this to teach math, are you going to get the same results? Is it going to be the same no matter what? And this is also where you'll see a little bit of the challenge in education, because remember when I was talking about how samples can be so different, how populations can be so different, reliability can get tricky if we're talking about students who may be gifted or English language learners or in special education. All those things aren't necessarily going to be reliable from population to population to population. It may be a reliable measure, but only a reliable measure for students within a certain population or with certain characteristics. All the studies that you look at should talk a little bit about reliability and validity. In the quantitative studies, it will be a measurement. You'll get something like a test, retest reliability. So you'll actually be able to see, when this particular test was used and then used again, what was the correlation between those two scores. So you actually have a number, and that's really helpful. The same thing with the validity. In qualitative study, You use a number of different coding methods. You use something called triangulation, where you're pulling from different sources. You can use field notes, memos. You could have an outside researcher also look at the work and do coding, and then do comparison coding. So there's a lot of other ways to do reliability and validity, but you don't get that numerical piece that you do in a quantitative study. At this point, all of us are bombarded with technology. We're bombarded with news articles, with things on television, with studies that are passed around on Facebook or Twitter. We get all of these sources of information saying researchers found, this study found, but the reality is oftentimes there are huge problems with those research studies or with the methodology of, the researchers found that eating potato chips every day, is good for your health. Well, what they fail to tell you is that those people are eating one chip a day, and they're also, running 10 miles and, don't eat any trans fat anytime ever in their diet. So we have to be really careful about how we read research, and we need to make sure that we're conscious consumers, that we are picking through the research, that we're really asking questions about what the findings are, and we're looking to see what the limitations are, what's missing, or what could be added. And this isn't to say that all research is bad, but it's important for us to be good consumers and to make sure that we really do understand what's being studied, and we understand what could be done differently in that particular research. As you're reading research, I want you to think about a couple things. First, I want you to think, is this significant finding? So, is there something here that is of significance to you as a teacher? I call this kind of the so what, if you will. So what does it mean to you? If you're going to tell me that students who attend school on a regular basis have higher achievement, my so what on that's pretty low. Is it significant? I don't know that that's really significant in the terms of groundbreaking. I think it's important to know, but you need to think, is this a significant finding? What does this tell us about education or our own practice? Then you need to think, is this plausible? Could this really work? Does this make sense? The potato chip example I gave you a slide or two ago, does it really make sense if I tell you that people who eat potato chips, are healthier or live longer, or whatever it is that plausible? Because if it doesn't seem plausible to you, if something seems amiss, then you need to go back to the methodology and figure out what is missing. Let's take a look at my sample. Is it representative of the whole population? Let's look at my methods. What's missing in my methods? Who are my participants? How did I go about doing my data analysis? Am I only analyzing parts of my data instead of looking at the big picture? So these are questions you need to ask yourself as you're reading research. The last thing I want to point out when I'm talking about being a consumer of research is that all research has some sort of error. It's inherent. There's no way to get around not having error. If we're doing qualitative research, we all have biases, no matter how much we try to avoid them or how much we put in place to avoid bias. We all have biases, and that could come through. It's also important to know that even when you do statistical studies, there is a margin of error. There is a chance you are coming to the wrong conclusion. So you can't take research as 100%, truth all the time, because there is still a slight possibility that it might not actually be what it says. Again, even with statistics, we'll talk later on when we get to the quantitative portion of the semester about level 1 and type 1 and type 2 errors. But on both ends, there's a chance to make a mistake. There's a chance to get a false positive or a false negative. That happens in the medical field as well. Okay, so just to understand that there